אז שלום לכולם, אחר צהריים טובים. Professor Arner, are you with us? Just a moment. Let's wait for Professor Arner.
I can see and hear you. Can you all see me?
Okay, yes, now we can see you. Perfect. So good afternoon. I would like to welcome you all, and I'm delighted to see you all here. I will start in Hebrew and then switch into English. אז אני שמחה שהפעם פורום CBDC מתכנס אצלנו כאן במרכז לדיני בנקאות ורגולציה פיננסית. כמה מילים על המרכז, כי אני מניחה שלרבים מכם זו פעם ראשונה שהגעתם. המרכז לדיני בנקאות ורגולציה פיננסית הוא מרכז ותיק שהוקם במכללה עוד בשנת 2004. בשנים הראשונות לפעילותו המרכז התמקד בעיקר בדיני בנקאות, יחסי בנק לקוח והגנת הצרכן הפיננסי, אבל במשך השנים עם התרחבות הפעילות הפיננסית הן מצד התאגידים הבנקאיים והן מצד גופים חוץ-בנקאיים התרחבו בהתאם גם תחומי הפעולה של המרכז. התגברות הרגולציה בתחום הבנקאי והפיננסי הובילה את המרכז לעסוק גם בהיבטים של הסדרה, פיקוח ולהעמיק את הדיון בסוגיות של מדיניות. ולאחרונה כמובן אי אפשר שלא להיכנס לכל התחום של טכנולוגיה פיננסית וחדשנות, פינטק, שימוש בבינה מלאכותית, Cbdc כמובן ועניינים דומים. מלבד הפעילות המחקרית, המרכז שלנו מהווה פורום לדיונים פתוחים והעמקת הידע באמצעות פעילות של כנסים, ימי עיון, סדנאות, קבוצות עבודה. המרכז פועל תוך שיתוף פעולה בין הקהילה המדעית, התעשייה הפיננסית, רגולטורים וקובעי מדיניות, במטרה לייצר שיח פורה ומועיל, ונדמה לי שהמפגש שלנו היום הוא דוגמה טובה לכך. אז היום כאמור אנחנו שמחים לארח את המפגש השני של פורום CBDC ישראל. מאז המפגש האחרון חלו מספר התפתחויות בתחום. במבט גלובלי עוד ועוד מדינות הצטרפו למגמה, הן מעמיקות את המחקר והעבודה בתחום, מבצעות ניסויים ותוכניות פיילוט. לפי הערכות שבדקתי היום בבוקר, 112 מדינות כבר נמצאות עמוק בתהליך הזה. במקביל, כמו שאתם יודעים, גם בנק ישראל מתקדם עם פרויקט השקל הדיגיטלי. ביוני הבנק פרסם תוצאות של ניסוי מאוד מעניין לשימוש אפשרי בטכנולוגיה של DLT, איתריום, ובימים אלה אנחנו יודעים שבנק ישראל עובד על ניסויים נוספים. אז עכשיו אני אומר את כל זה באנגלית לכבוד האורח שלנו. I was just saying a few words in Hebrew about the Center for Banking Law and Financial Regulation, a long-standing center which I established here at the Netanya Academic College already in 2004. In the first years of its activity, the center focused mainly on bank-customer relationships and financial consumer protection. Over the years, with the expansion of financial activity all over the world, both through banking corporations and non-bank entities, the center areas of activity have expanded accordingly. The increase of regulation in the banking and financial fields led the center to also deal with aspects of regulation and supervision and to deepen the discussion on policy issues. And recently, of course, the center devotes a significant part of its activity to aspects of innovation, financial technology, fintech, the use of artificial intelligence, and more. Just a moment. But we have, please. Okay. In addition to its research activity, the center serves as a forum for open discussions and the deepening of knowledge through conferences, seminars, workshops, working groups, etc. The center operates in collaboration between the scientific community, the industry, the financial industry, regulators, and policymakers, with the aim of producing a valuable and productive discourse on current issues and challenges. And this meeting today is a good example of this. So today we are happy to host the second meeting of the Cbdc-Il Forum. By the way, I would like to welcome our rector, Professor Moshe Gelbard, say hello. This is a very, very new appointment from last week, and we all wish a lot of good luck and congratulations to our new rector and vice president of the college. So thank you very much for coming here today. Since the last meeting of the CBDC Forum, there have been further developments in the field. From a global perspective, more and more countries are joining the trend, deepening research and work in the field, conducting experiments and pilot programs, and in general, examining a possible issuance of a CBDC. According to sources I checked this morning, 112 countries are deeply in the process. Very, very impressive. On the local scene, the Bank of Israel is also moving forward with the digital shekel project. Last June, the bank finished an important experiment on the possibility of using DLT Ethereum technology for this purpose. And currently, as can be assumed, they are working on additional experiments. Before we continue to the central part of our meeting, the guest lecture of Professor Arner, I would first like to invite the founders of the Cbdc-Il Forum to say a few words, either in Hebrew or in English. And we will start with CPA Ilanit Adesman-Navon, partner and head of Financial Risk Management Department at KPMG Israel. Please.
עכשיו זה מתחייב באנגלית, לא?
English or Hebrew, as you prefer.
Hebrew.
Hebrew. You can say
You will excuse me, I prepared it in Hebrew.
Okay.
Okay. אז באמת עברו 3 חודשים מהמפגש הקודם, כמו שפרופסור רותי אמרה לנו, יש הרבה חידושים בתחום ה-CBDC, אבל יש גם חידושים בתחומים שמתחרים עם CBDC. דיברנו בפעם הקודמת על חלק מהבעיות בשיטת התשלומים הקיימת, שמדברים על חוסר המיידתיות של התשלומים, לפחות בנושא של המיידתיות, מיידיות של התשלומים, אז יש את תקן ISO 222 של סוויפט, שאנחנו מכירים אותו ככה בחודשים האחרונים מתפשט, גם כמובן על ידי סוויפט בין המדינות, גם בתוך המדינות, תקן התשלומים חדש באנגליה, ארצות הברית הפד הודיעה שהולך לכיוונים האלה. כמובן לתחום ה-CBDC עדיין יש יתרונות נוספים, חוץ מהמיידיות של התשלום, כל הנושא של הסמארט קונטרקט, שיכול לתת לנו את הייעוד של המאני, של הכסף, כל הנושא של בעצם אפשרות לעשות KYC-AML פעם אחת לכל אדם, לכל עסק, באמצעות אותו ארנק דיגיטלי של הבנק המרכזי, וכמובן יתרונות אחרים. בהמשך נדון, אני מניחה, גם בטכנולוגיה, כשנגיע לסשן של הטכנולוגיה, נדון כמה זה מפריע, כמה זה תורם, יכול להשלים, מתחרה, אבל אני חושבת שבהחלט יש מקום לדיון ובהשוואה בין ה-CBDC ל-ISO 222. תודה על הפורום, תודה על ההשתתפות, ונשמח להמשיך את הפורום הזה גם בעתיד.
Okay. So just a quick translation. Ilanit just mentioned the development, huge development in developing in CBDC in various countries, but at the same time there are serious threats to this development, mainly
competition, not
competition or threat. Yes, mainly because of the Swift
protocol, ISO 200.
Swift protocol, ISO 20022, new technological means, and it will be very interesting. Afterwards, we'll be divided into working groups, and it will be very interesting to discuss these issues in more details. Okay, so now, Dr. Mili.
No, I'll leave the floor to you, and we will have some additional opening in the after the presentation.
Okay, but I just want to formally present the 3 founders of the Cbdc-Il Forum. So Ilanit Adesman was the first one. Here we have Dr. Millie Perry with us, the director of the Blockchain Excellence Center at the Israeli Chamber of Information Technology. And she will give her speech later after your guest lecture. And also the third founder is Shmulik Ben Tovim, the chairperson of the Israeli FinTech community, who unfortunately was unable to attend, but he sent his warm greetings. So now we move to our guest lecture, and it is really a great pleasure and honor to have today with us Professor Douglas Arner. Presenting all of his extensive, really extensive activities will take me a good few hours. Therefore, I will limit myself to describing the main highlights. Professor Arner is the Kerry Holdings Professor in Law and Associate Dean of the Hong Kong University Faculty of Law. He specializes in economic and financial law, regulation and development, and he is one of the leading international experts in these fields. Professor Arner has published 18 books. It's not a mistake, right? 18 books and more than 150 articles, chapters, and reports. He is among the top 50 authors in the world by article downloads, and his work is often referred to by other researchers. He won a few prestigious research grants from the Hong Kong government, RGC, for his works on fintech policy and regulation, digital finance, financial stability, and financial inclusion, and lately for a huge project on fintech and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I must also mention that Professor Arner initiated one of the world's largest massive open online courses, MOOC, on financial technology, now with over 100,000 students spanning almost every country in the world. And in addition to his academic work, Professor Arner has served as a consultant with the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, the United Nations, EPEC, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and more. So we are very grateful to you, Professor Arner, for accepting our invitation and delivering to us today a lecture on the global perspectives of the CBDC, which is based on your work and research on the topic. So the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Ruth, and really great to see you again. And thanks for the invitation to be here today. This is, this topic of central bank digital currencies. If I think back over the past 2 years, the two topics that I've spent the most time talking about with central bankers and policymakers are Regtech and central bank digital currencies. I think from the standpoint of central bankers and regulators, these are really two of the big topics. And I want to bring up some slides which they'll be distributed afterwards as well. And let me just.
Thank you.
One second. Okay, let's see if this will work now. All right, and so these actually refer to a series of work, not only from me, but especially from my colleagues, Dirk Zetsche at the University of Luxembourg and Ross Buckley at the University of New South Wales. And I think the key point, and this is one thing that I think you all are already familiar with, this idea of central bank digital currencies. Often people will focus on the decentralized technological aspect. But I think it's, from my standpoint, important that actually we're looking at two parallel trends, I think, in payments technology that are really increasingly coming together in the context of money, payments, and central bank digital currencies. And of course, the basic idea here is that money, payments, finance, and the technological horizon really are co-developmental over the entirety of human history. We can think from shells to carved stones to early coinage, paper money, checks, bills, the telegraph, early electronic payments, SWIFT, RTGS systems, mobile money, Bitcoin, central bank digital currencies. That's what, 6,000 years of human financial, social, economic history. And so it's not surprising that as new technologies develop, we would be looking to see their implications. And I think, if we look at the two strands, one has come through centralized systems, particularly RTGS systems, mobile money systems, and most recently, fast payment systems. And the other has really come from Bitcoin and blockchain developments over what is now almost 15 years. It's incredible that it really is almost 15 years since the original Bitcoin white paper. And I think it's something that if we look at central banks have, if you think about core function of central banks in the context of monetary stability and financial stability as a public good, and their intersection with macroeconomic policy, it's really the payment system that brings all of these things together. And so central banks have a long history of involvement in payment systems, whether that is something like coinage or printing, or more recently, the development of RTGS and a range of other systems. And so if we think about the technologies that central bankers are most comfortable with, it's really payments technology. Central banks, when you think about it, tend to actually be generally at the cutting edge of these technologies. So many central banks actually started experimenting. If we think about China in 2013, experimenting with blockchain to see whether or not it might be usable in the context of their own payment systems development. And it has to be said that most countries by 2018 had largely come to the conclusion that the technology was interesting, but in terms of speed and robustness,
Professor Arner, just a moment, please. We cannot hear you. The problem is on our side.
Okay. Let me know when or if you have any luck. It's funny, almost 2.5 years into this, we're still running into these technological problems. It's amazing.
Just a moment.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, now we can hear you. Perfect. You can continue.
Okay, so the point where I had left off was by 2018, most central banks had come to the conclusion that blockchain technology was interesting, but not likely to be an immediate replacement to centralized systems like RTGS and FPS systems. But really, Facebook's Libra proposal in 2019 dramatically changed this. And you mentioned the numbers of central banks. If we look at the surveys of central banks looking at central bank digital currencies pre and post Libra, say January 2019 versus January 2020, there's an absolutely dramatic transformation in the number of central banks that are looking at central bank digital currencies. And of course, if we take the Chinese example, it's no coincidence at all that the formal announcement of the launch of what was then initially called DCEP, the Digital Currency Electronic Payment System, now usually referred to as the ECNY, came just 2 months after the Libra announcement. We can see this driven forward by COVID. That I think if we think about the last couple of years, COVID has really driven digitization of everything, but more than anything else, of payments, and the utility of universal access and the ability to deliver payments to an entire population has proven tremendously significant in response and resilience to COVID. And at the same time, I think Libra highlighted very directly in a way that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies never really had, that it was possible to have a real competitor, a possible substitute, not only to developing country currencies, but in fact to major currencies. And that stimulus from Libra, I think, was tremendously important. Now, we can see the global regulatory response in the context of stablecoins, and this, of course, is accelerating as a result of market volatility over the past year. But the other place we see this is in the context of CBDCs. And once you have the announcement by the Chinese central bank in October of 2019 of its intention to go live with national trials in 2020, this becomes an immediate stimulus for particularly major economies, major currency issuing central banks to accelerate their own projects. And I think what is important here is this idea that central bank digital currencies span a tremendous range of different types of projects. Some are more monetary, some are payments, some are a combination. You have public, private, you have wholesale, you have retail, you have domestically focused, you have foreign focused. Liabilities, finality, privacy discussions. What are its interactions with cash? All of these things mean that each central bank digital currency project is different with different legal and regulatory issues. And I think this comes into this context that I mentioned earlier of central bank functions. And we're seeing, as a result, different central banks, different countries looking for different achievements, different objectives that they're trying to address via central bank digital currencies. And I think the Chinese example is an interesting one because China is has such a well-developed electronic payment system via Alipay and WeChat Pay. But in some ways, that was exactly, in addition to Libra, the spur for the original system development. In other words, you'll often hear said that one of the big spurs was financial stability. The risks that one or both of those systems would go down, and therefore the need for the central bank to come up with its own system to act as a backup. It's also the case that until the launch of the DCEP, the ECNY project, that Alipay and WeChat Pay were non-interoperable. These were closed payment and closed, generally, digital ecosystems. And once again, part of the rationale of the ECNY was actually to force interoperability. If nothing else, if you had the ECNY operating as the base monetary instrument underlying both of those sets of electronic payment rails, it then became very easy to go from one to the ECNY to the other. And in fact, there has also been a parallel process from a regulatory standpoint, which has now resulted in direct interoperability between those systems. It's also the case that if we think of the rationale, one of the most important and one that I think is common not only for developing countries, but really for many other countries, and that is financial inclusion. It's often said that Alipay, WeChat Pay each have 1 billion customers. but China's population is in the neighborhood of 1.3, 1.4 billion. That leaves you a good 300 million people that actually don't have access to Alipay or WeChat Pay. Generally poor, generally uneducated, generally minority language speakers spread across rural areas of the country, often old. And we saw some of the challenges that this group really highlights in the context of China's ongoing COVID lockdowns and the challenges of people actually helping their parents to try to make financial transfers to enable them to get food in the context of COVID lockdowns like we're seeing in Chengdu right now. That has been one of the big focuses. In other words, that Alipay, WeChat Pay, because they are commercial, won't go to everyone. And so part of the target of the CNY is for the population, which is non-commercially viable, and really to extend the reach of digital payments for a range of reasons to that population. A big objective, which ended up not being, in my view, successfully fulfilled, was also towards financial inclusion of foreigners, of tourists. Now, of course, very few people have gone to China in the past almost 3 years now. But prior to that, if I think of my last trip to Beijing in November of 2019, as a foreigner, it was actually very difficult to pay for things. You'd go into a store, you try to pay for a taxi. No one wants cash. No one has change for anything. They're not taking credit cards. And the end result is you couldn't get Alipay or WeChat Pay because the base identification system for AML and other purposes is the mobile phone, which is tied to your national identity, which is then tied to a bank account. If you have no national identity card, you can't get a bank account, you can't get a mobile phone, you can't get Alipay, you can't get WeChat Pay, you can't do anything. Now, had the Winter Olympics gone according to plan and millions of foreign tourists come into China, they would have actually had serious problems really doing much of anything. And so one of the objectives of the CNY was to provide a mechanism to bring them in. Financial integrity, obviously, and it's been very clear from the very beginning that from a privacy standpoint, the PBOC is collecting massive amounts of data out of this system, going to the government for a range of different purposes, which includes monitoring all aspects of financial integrity and other forms of behavior. It's also the case, however, that because China has basically eliminated, or is trying its very best to eliminate cryptocurrencies, but blockchain is a national priority, you do run into this problem of how do you make payments? And so the central bank digital currency is a direct answer to this, that the state will provide the digital currency, which can then be used in the context, for instance, of BSN blockchain services network transactions and other applications. And it has to be said that in its initial design, this was entirely a domestically focused system. But over the past couple of years, as geopolitical concerns have risen, there has been an ever greater linkage between the ECNY project and RMB internationalization projects. And at this stage, all of those are generally theoretical, except that we do have, obviously, the joint project with the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. There is another joint project with ASEAN, another joint project with the UAE Central Bank, and a range of others, where we have governments looking at possible interoperability and different systems on a cross-border basis. Skip the euro and the dollar. You know, I think when we look at possible directions, I think we're seeing a division between your major currencies, and really the driver between the sort of G3 currency issuers in many ways is competition. And that's something that I think is driving all of them forward. But in some ways, from the standpoint of everyone else, that's a real challenge, because if the dollar or the euro or the CNY become very easily usable outside those jurisdictions, it actually provides a very real risk of currency substitution, not just to developing countries, but in fact to developed countries. And so we can see other developed countries, Sweden, Canada, et cetera, looking at issues both of the fact that cash is increasingly not used. And so from a central bank standpoint, the need to provide a credible alternative, but also from the standpoint of potential competition from digital major currencies. If we look at financial centers, we see the UK, Switzerland, Singapore, Hong Kong, all very focused much more on the wholesale side than the retail side. Because if you think about the cross-border aspects, particularly the possibility of embedding payments into financial transactions and dealing with some of our historical separation risks between payments and transactions, this is perhaps where some of the biggest gains can come. And actually, if we look at where central bank digital currencies have actually been launched, they've actually been primarily in developing countries, Cambodia, Bahamas, Nigeria, all trying to use central bank digital currencies as a way to address problems with their own payment and financial systems. And I think this is actually the key point of analysis, is a realization that each country, each region, each jurisdiction, that you have different situations. And as a result, the way that you can use technology to address those problems will vary from place to place. I think this is also being picked up in the context of international arrangements, the G20 payments roadmap, and increasingly, particularly in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine last February, we're seeing discussions about potential implications for the future of the international monetary system. And I'll just flash these and then wrap up. You know, one option, of course, is one could have the emergence of a new dominant currency. It could be the CNY, it could be a cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, etc. One could have, actually, the technology is there to build a better international monetary and payment system, a sort of combined SWIFT ESDR that probably for the majority of countries in the world would be highly attractive. But from the standpoint of geopolitical competition amongst our major economies, less attractive. It could, in fact, actually reinforce the US dollar. In other words, if it becomes very, very easy to use the dollar internationally, that could actually make it more attractive. And you could actually see larger amounts of currency substitution in many places. But our central case is an increased amount of multipolarity, because we think that the advent of technology actually makes it easier to deal in multiple currencies at a single time. And that removes what was perhaps the core convenience factor that often underlined a single dominant currency. So I've talked a little bit longer than I intended to. I've covered a bunch of different ground and happy to talk about just about anything that I've covered or not covered for that matter.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Arner, for a most interesting lecture. I see that some of my students joined us. We have exactly a class on money, technology, and law. So these are our students. תודה רבה שהצטרפתם לסטודנטים שלי. And now we'll open the session for questions from the audience. Who would like to start, please? If you can present yourself loudly in English and pose your question, if possible. Yes. But Yitzhak, can Professor Arner see us? The whole.
I can't see the whole room, but if whoever's speaking has a microphone, it'll probably be easy.
Yeah, just a moment, please. Oh, Great.
Yes.
Okay, please.
Hi, Sun Logical Forum. Question about the inflation. In the past few years, about $3 trillion were basically conjured from the thin air in the crypto market. I didn't see a discussion about the influence of that on the inflation, especially if we're talking about a smaller economy like Israel. If there was the Israeli shekel, a digital one, an AAA country, serving as a collateral in the crypto markets, instead of some shady, unclear private stable coin, what would do to economy if the interest rates of the crypto markets would propagate to the regular banking system, etc.
Okay,
So I
let's
didn't
hear.
hear about the macro influence.
Yeah, I think there are two sides of this, and the first is really on this side of inflation and a question of whether a sort of digital currency might be inflationary. And of course, because if you think about a sort of digital currency, it is a fiat currency in the same way that paper currency is, and so it has the same sort of potential risks. I guess from the standpoint of, say, digital asset markets, the idea or the hope is that at least if you are using a sort of sovereign currency, that you will, one, avoid the sort of, if you will, the structure of some of the non-sovereign cryptocurrencies, which from a price standpoint, particularly Bitcoin, has an embedded structure that will encourage price increases and therefore have an impact. So it's, I think, a mixed question, and it really depends on the individual country and central bank, their sort of own inflation position, how much difference it makes from the standpoint of the crypto markets. But I guess at the end of the day, it is something that states are used to, the responsibility that goes with fiat currency issuance. So at least central banks are not necessarily uncomfortable with that arrangement, and many of them prefer it to the potential alternative of substitution via crypto markets.
Thank you. Please,
Can I
Amelie.
Can I?
I would like to hear your view. My name is Mili Terry. Nice to be here today, and it was a wonderful presentation. I would like to hear your view about the how can I call it national inclusivity regarding developing countries, because they don't have the you know, the system in the banking system in place, the more
شو اسمه شرح طبيعي.
Sorry?
לא, סליחה, אם אפשר.
Okay, I mean the legacy system do not send in the way to create the CBDC as in the more developed countries. Can you see this as a jumpstart or as a more maybe inclusive operation to bring in the more developed countries into the global economy?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely the case. And in many ways, we think that probably the greatest impact actually comes in the developing country context, where you are using technology to improve the functioning of the monetary and payment system. You know, if we look at Cambodia, for instance, Cambodia is an example of a country which really didn't have a well-functioning monetary system, payment system, or financial system, and basically developing a quasi-CBDC. There are arguments about what it is exactly, but what it is exactly is that the majority of the population now has an app that enables them easily to make payments in both the Cambodian currency as well as in US dollars. And that has been absolutely transformative, both from the standpoint of much of the population, as well as from the standpoint of the central bank actually trying to encourage use of the domestic currency. And so, yeah, I think this is one of the biggest aspects. I would say, one, for countries that are afraid of currency substitution, the incentive is actually to build a digital monetary framework that is more attractive than some of the potential competitors. We've seen some countries trying to do this with a direct adoption of Bitcoin, but that generally hasn't been overly successful so far. Rather, we're seeing other countries which are basically facing the potential competition and using it as an argument to improve their own currencies. The second is obviously the benefits of digital payments access. And from a development and an SDG standpoint, we're actually finding that universal access to payments is probably even more important than mobile phone or bank account access. In some ways, it's the ability to make a payment that makes the phone or the account actually useful from an economic or other sort of standpoint. And I think the final one, which has not gotten that much focus, and often people in developed countries will end up talking about this possibility that you could give a bank account with the central bank to every person in a country. And what would this do to the existing banking system? This is all well and good if you're talking about a country with a well-functioning banking system. But if you're talking about a country like Cambodia, which doesn't really have a functioning banking system, actually giving everyone an account directly with the central bank is a massive improvement over any of the alternatives. And so this is my point about looking at the factual situation on the ground and figuring out how you can actually use technology to design systems that will make an improvement.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Noam Josephidis. I want to ask a question. When speaking about the CBDC, the inherent tension or maybe the friction is between centralization and decentralization, which is one of the foundational stones of the Web3 or crypto premise, let's say. Now, I imagine that, central banks trying to issue or regulate national cryptocurrency would find it hard to relinquish control over data, while as the quote-unquote free cryptocurrencies kind of inherently promise at least some amount of decentralization, maybe implied privacy. We saw the whole crypto market go up in storm the past few weeks over the OFAC decision to ban addresses interacting with Tornado Cash. That's kind of a big discussion right now. So do you see in all of the discussions that you're privy to on the national banks or central banks, is the privacy and decentralization topic even on the table for discussion when trying to compare it as an alternative to cash money, which is still kind of private?
Yeah, no, this is one of your biggest questions. And it varies from country to country, because at the end of the day, privacy is a design feature. And so if you think about China, where the level of comfort or acceptance or expectation of state data collection is very high, it's not a surprise that the central bank is very open that it will use this, collect massive amounts of data, which it will use for its own purposes, but it will not make that available to the private sector. So, but if you look at, for instance, the EU, the single biggest factor of concern from a user standpoint in all of the surveys is privacy. And as you say, one of the biggest attractions of cash is its anonymity. And as a result, particularly in countries where you have well-functioning monetary and payment systems already, reasonably functioning banking systems, that attraction can be very high. It's interesting. A couple of years ago, there was a leaked memo from a Canadian parliamentary committee, and the central bank rep was saying, you know, this is potentially very valuable from the standpoint of law enforcement, tax evasion, money laundering, and it's a balance. You know, how do you determine as a society, as a government, what is going to be the acceptable level of data collection and use? But it's not just about the society and the government. There's also this market factor. In other words, will people actually use it? And one of the questions about the ECNY in particular is if it becomes usable offshore, will the fact that it likely collects data impact the attractiveness of its use to other parties? And of course, let's think about something like the digital dollar. Now, my favorite statistics, the US actually prints in the neighborhood of 2 billion $100 bills each year. The vast majority of those are exported. Now, the attraction for most of the users of those $100 bills is, of course, the monetary value, the fact that you can use it, but also the anonymity. So if you are the US, you have to be very careful in designing a digital dollar, because if everyone knows that it collects data, then they may simply not want to use it. And in fact, what you've done is you've actually reversed the attractiveness of your monetary instrument to many of your users. And so this, I think, is absolutely a core question of design, and one that has tremendous not only social and legal issues, but also demand and supply issues.
Thank you. We will have 2 more questions, please.
Hi there. My name is Ron Pelik. First of all, regarding your last point there, is there any information available at this point about take-up of in terms of use of CBDCs in countries which have already launched one? That's a quick data question. But other than that, I mean, we touched upon some of the motivations for launching CBDC, and we said on one hand we have the emerging countries, which have issues of financial inclusion, etc., and that's quite a clear motivation. We have, on the other hand, the G3, right, where there's a lot of geopolitics that is involved in the motivation. And the question is really about those countries, like Israel, to some extent stuck in the middle, kind of, which are highly digitized, generally speaking, already. And so financial inclusion is less of an issue. But on the other hand, the geopolitical motivation is not really relevant to a large extent. And there you mentioned Canada and Sweden, so they have specific issues. But other than that, are there any other real strong motivations that you can identify for countries like Israel for wanting to have a CBDC? Thank you.
Yeah, very good questions. I'll hit the first one. On the take-up, we've got pretty good data on the Bahamas, where it's proving quite useful and popular. Cambodia, where you've had pretty dramatic take-up. The majority of the population has picked up the app and is using it quite regularly. Nigeria, it hasn't been going very long. You're having a range of use, but it's kind of hard to say. From the standpoint of China, China is still technically in the pilot stage, but the app, which is now pretty readily available, has been downloaded by something like over 300 million people and is widely in use, though still being a pilot transaction. I think China is an interesting one because there was a real question: if everybody already has Alipay, WeChat Pay, are they going to bother to do it? And one thing that I think we have seen is that the central bank, and we can see this in Hong Kong as well, but one thing that you can actually do with a CBDC is a range of sort of monetary experiments and incentives. In other words, it's not a CBDC in the Hong Kong context, but the Hong Kong government over the past year or two has on numerous occasions given electronic basically transfer payments to the entire population, but those have an expiry date. In other words, if you don't spend it by a certain date, it vanishes. And the objective there is to incentivize spending as opposed to savings. And so in those places where I think Cambodia is a really obvious one where there was a huge need, and so the take-up has been quite impressive. Bahamas, Nigeria, both lots of alternatives, but fairly big take-up. China, there was a real question of whether anyone would really care at all, and the take-up has so far been pretty solid. But yeah, data is still at a pretty early stage on all of these. You know, from the standpoint of motivation, I think currency substitution remains valid. I would say probably the big two for countries which have developed and digitized financial systems. The first of those is really in the context of wholesale payments. The ability potentially to embed a payment into a transaction. So for instance, if we think about a securities transaction, in a securities transaction, there is a separation of the securities settlement and the payments transaction. And this is a sort of long time risk that is embedded in all sorts of financial and other transactions. And the CBDC allows you the possibility of basically bringing those together and eliminating that payment settlement risk. So I think that's one where we're seeing more and more work done, and where there's a potential real use case in particularly wholesale finance. The second is, I think, in the context of cross-border transactions and the possibility that we will see systems which are essentially designed to make it easier and cheaper to deal with cross-border transactions. And I think that's actually something very important that Libra really did do. It showed us that we can build a better cross-border payment system. We just didn't really want Facebook to do it. And so I think the G20 project around the payments roadmap is actually all about this. And so I think at some stage, the fact of having a CBDC may be useful from that standpoint, but that's still pretty early. I would say probably your big one, other than the monetary policy uses, the sort of innovation uses, is really around embedding payments into wholesale transactions.
Thank you. And the last very quick question and quick answer. Please.
Good afternoon. I think I want to thank you for the first. I would like to thank you for this excellent and very interesting lecture. My name is Lila Sheva-Glatifuelov. I'm from the Central Bank, from the Research Department, and in particular from the economic team of the CBDC of Israel. So I really appreciate all the interesting information that you brought here. And I would like to ask you to finalize this discussion, because lately the EU just published their kind of proposal or ideas with respect to the uses of the CBDC. And their comment was that apparently it will be a complementary to the cash and not replacing cash. And I would like to hear from you if you know a little bit about if you have an insight on the discussions that were before reading that. Is it really connected to the idea that it will be more cross-border kind of instrument and less replacement to the anonymity and all the rest of the considerations that you commented on, Roman?
Yeah, so I think the euro is an interesting one because, of course, the ECB has done a tremendous amount of work on digital payments, both at the wholesale level in the context of Target 2.
I'm afraid you are on mute, Professor Arner.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
We don't hear you.
Okay.
We cannot hear you. It's hard. It's on your side, probably. אולי אחד הסטודנטים יכול רגע לדבר, להגיד מילה, נראה אם זה משם או אצלנו.
Yes, we hear you.
רלימור, שנשמע אותה, הנה נרמין,
אבל היא
כן,
על מיוט.
גם על מיוט. לא, היא על מיוט, נרמין.
אנחנו שומעים אותו.
Working, not working.
כן, אנחנו
It's working.
We apologize. We are very... Okay. Okay, Professor Arner, can you hear us? Yes.
Yes, I can hear fine. Can you hear me yet?
Okay. Unfortunately, we cannot hear you. So you owe an answer to Lilach, to the Bank of Israel, exactly, to the Bank of Israel. And maybe if it's possible, maybe later you can send me an email with the answer if it is not a burden, and so I will forward it to all the participants. We would like to thank you very, very much for an excellent lecture. And we hope to be able to meet in other opportunities. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks very much. And sorry about the technical issues.
Now, switching to Hebrew. הסטודנטים משוחררים, ואנחנו הקהל יוצאים להפסקה של...
כן, 10 דקות, קופי אאוט, ונחזור לפעילות.
תודה רבה. נכון, גם אני שמעתי שמונה.
יש להם הרבה חיים קשים. אוי, חבל.
חבל, שאלה נורא מעניינת.
שאלה שאלה מאוד מעניינת, מאוד רלוונטית. ההשפעה שלו היה מאוד הבלגה.
איתן, תודה שהגעת.
Perché non ti va un'idea che tempi. No, lei va in Adesso מעולה, רק שנייה. תודה רבה. יש פגעת, פה
פשוט לסגור את הזום.
כל יום אני כל הזמן הולכת עם הרוק, כל יום אני במזגנים.
במזגנים, הבלתי נסבלים.
כן, אז או שאתה במזגן, או שאתה יוצא חוץ שלך. אתה מזכר שלך איץ. מילי, דרגיר סקינן.
מלמדת פה?
לא, אני לא מלמדת פה, אני עובדת עם הבן תחומי.
כן, אז יש בצד.
כן, לא, זה לא היה כיסא שלי.
מה אתה בבן תחומי?
אני בתחום של חדשנות, ואני עובדת עם אקסלרטורים. כן, גם אני עוסקת הרבה מאוד סטארט-אפים בחדשנות, אני חושבת שבאתי ייעוץ. לא כמו קייטים.
יש לי הרבה כובעים. אני חברת הנהלה באיגוד הפינטק. אני מנהלת מרכז בלוקצ'יין ו-NGO של משקלת טכנולוגית מידע. אני בעיקר עובדת עם ארגונים בינלאומיים, עם World Economic Forum, European Version Association, co-chair של עינת בנק, של חברות הבלוקצ'יין בעולם. אני עובדת באיזו. ואני מלמדת באקדמיה. אני מלמדת ברחמים בקיץ, בלוקצ'יין, אני מלמדת במכללת רמת גן, באונו אני מלמדת בלוקצ'יין לתואר שני משפטים.
מה המקום שלכם?
בקיבוץ, יש לי דוקטורט בתחום של מדעי המידע, בבר אילן, ודוקטורט נוסף בתחום של מדעי תרבות, והגעתי לזה בגלל שעשיתי מחקר על אזורי סחר חופשי שמיועדים להחצנה של אומנות. והם חיפשו שם כלי שמצד אחד ישקיף את הדרישות של הרגולטור, ומצד שני ישמור על האנונימיות של השחקנים, שהם טייקונים גדולים, ושם נפלתי לבלוקצ'יין, והכלל של הדוקטורט הראשון עסקתי בעיקר בתיאוריות אנונימיות, אז המרכז העניין שלי, המדעי, המחקרי, זה בדרך. זה האישו המרכזי שאני עוסקת בו. אני מקווה שבאיזשהו מקום כבר ירצו ללמוד על דאו.
אז האמת שזה עוד מעניין אותי, בעולם שאני נכנסתי אליו בעבר, וקראתי לאקשן, עזבתי אותו באיזשהו שלב, עם ספורט כי הלכתי לפנות דברים, אז זה נורא מעניין אותי, זה גם שאני כל זה טוב שאתה מראה.
אבל עושים המון אירועים. 052 שנה.
רגע, גם למדתי עכשיו. תעשי כבר.
עשיתי?
כן. תחפצי.
ליד כאילו?
עכשיו רליס, כמו
אתם חייבים לצודק.
הנה,
אתם צריכים לעשות את זה ככה. touch and go.
אז יש לי משהו טוב לסטארט-אפ.
סליחה? מעולה.
יש לי את האפליקציה, זה סטארט-אפ שאני באתי איתו, שעושה באמת העברה של מחירים, אבל
לא, זה פשוט לא הגיוני. תודה, אלי. אני מחליטה את המשקפיים של גוגל, בכניסים, יגידו לי מי בלי שאני צריך להסתכל על שיהיה לה מצח.
אבל היה
החלום שלי.
לא, ולא.
גם שלי.
אני ראיתי שני סטארט-אפים.
יש לזה עניין שאנחנו, כן, זה לא רק זה, הרי את חושבת בן אדם, ואת יודעת שבקשת אותו. ואת יודעת שאת יודעת אין לך מושג בשם שלו, כי את לא זוכרת ש... עכשיו עוד יותר אני לא זוכרת. טוב, בואו ניכנס, יש זמן קצר. פגשתי אותו. וזה הדבר שהוא יוציא את זה מתוך אנשי הקשר, וייתן לך ריוויו. שלום, זאת לי פגשת אותה בכנס שלנו. אבל זה מאחורי הגב, מה שאמרת עליה, הוא יעביר לך. והיא גם יודעת את זה. מה שנקרא ירוק לאדום. טוב, אז בואו נעבור לחלק הדיוני של המפגש. באנו הנה לדבר, לא רק לשמוע. אז אני מקווה שלא איבדנו אף אחד בדרך, בקפה. איבדנו? אוקיי, בסדר, הפסד שלהם. טוב, אז שמי מילי פרי. המטרה של הפורום הזה של CBDC, שאני מזמינה אתכם, מי שלא יתחבר, להיכנס גם לקבוצה בפייסבוק. אנחנו מעבירים שם עדכונים ורעיונות חדשים וכל מיני דברים מהחדשות. אני חושבת שזה מקום טוב להתעדכן בו. אני מקווה שאתם בפייסבוק, לא כולם עושים. רק בלינק. אני בקבוצה שלה, ואני לא. אני קוראת ככה מיד אחד, אני קוראת ואני נהנית. מעולה. אוקיי, תודה רבה.
אני בסנטר.
אוקיי, בסדר. טוב, אז אני רואה שאיתן סוף עזר, לא, איתן פה, אוקיי, אז אני אגיד לכם מה התכנון להיום, בגלל שאנחנו קבוצה ככה די אינטימית, אז לא נתחלק לקבוצות, אלא נעשה את הדיון במיליה, כאן על השולחן. מה שאנחנו נעשה אחרי שאנחנו נבדוק עם איתן את הכיוונים שלו, ואנחנו נשמע ממובילות הקבוצות. אחד הדברים שאני הכי שמחה בו, שיש כאן מובילות בפורום הזה, למרות שההרכב הוא גברי ברובו, אז אנחנו נבקש